Hi everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of our screencast on migration. And we'll begin here with a discussion of the UN Refugee Agency Global Trends Forced Displacement in 2021. The trends are rather shocking in terms of the number of people that are displaced, with 89.3 million forcibly displaced worldwide at the end of 2021 as the result of persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, or other serious events disturbing the public order. 3.8 million refugees are hosted in Turkey, when this is the largest population worldwide, with Colombia having 1.8 million, including Venezuelans displaced abroad. 72% of people are hosted in neighboring countries. 72% of refugees and Venezuelans displaced abroad lived in countries neighboring their countries of origins. 83% are hosted in low and middle income countries. I think this is if you think about the discussions and the politics around migration in the United States, for example, and you see figures like this and numbers like this, 83% are hosted in low and middle income countries. Again, the least developed countries provide asylum to 27% of the total. Relative to their national populations, the island in Aruba hosted the largest number of Venezuelans displaced abroad, 1 in 6. While Lebanon hosted the largest number of refugees, 1 in 8. And you can see the other statistics there. Turkey down at 1 in 23. So moving on here, another ethnographic example to cover is the work by Andersson. This is 2012 article that's available on the course Learning Management System page. You can also Google this and find it that way as well. Andersson's 2012, A Game of Risk, Boat Migration, Business of Bordering Europe. And so what Andersson's pointing out here is the development of an entirely new industry. And along with that industry, this idea of policing borders, come careers, networks, knowledge, and money. And so this becomes discipline. This becomes a thing to study, and of course the birth of disciplines and how, the interesting questions of how they're produced and when they're produced over time. And some of this has to do with technology and changing technologies, but some of this also has to do with changing conceptualizations of the world as a whole, and then what can actually be done and the scale at which it can be done, as well as the overall investment. So what Andersson attempts to do in the article is to understand the system in which migrant illegality is produced. And so Andersson notes that along the Euro-African border, there's a new national coordination centers that are being integrated and known as Eurosur, the European External Border Surveillance System. So the interest in Spain in 2005 came from sub-Saharan migrants who launched, according to Andersson, what the media called a massive assault on the fences surrounding the country's northern African enclaves. And so Spain launches this unprecedented naval operation along West African coasts with the EU's young border agency at the time, Frontex. And so Andersson draws from Beck's 2009 work in how risk is conceptualized. So risk in Beck's work is this idea of anticipating the catastrophe to come. And so this catastrophe is created, is planned for, this idea of a massive invasion or a massive assault, as individuals are coming up on boats and what that looks like. And so we also see here questions that we will address in later sections too, this idea of militarization of policing with a general population, but here specifically looking at that in the context of immigration, and how this might be a trend of things to come in other settings as well. So, as Andersson notes, the priority is to save human lives, and this entails intercepting all the boats that try to arrive in Spain before they reach the coast. So, this idea of humanitarianism enables a migration of sovereignty away from the European shores by dissolving the patchwork of maritime boundaries. So, this idea that countries have these different zones, these economic exclusion zones. They also have territorial water zones, and what and how that is regulated and where that line stops is something that, according to Guild and Andersson, that this idea of humanitarianism justifies extending this sovereignty out. In other words, something has to be done about this crisis, this risk to come. And so this idea of moving that border. And so such sea surveillance depends on framing of boat migration as inherently dangerous by definition, a risk to life. So migrants, by moving to the boat, this automatically becomes a risky situation. And indeed, is of course, it can be with the boats that are packed, that are smaller to evade being caught. This leads to greater risk overall. So the sea surveillance depends on framing boat migration as inherently dangerous by definition, a risk to life. So it becomes a humanitarian emergency as soon as these attempted migrants are getting on the boat. So migrants had to be prevented from leaving for their own good. So risk here, and again, Andersson's borrowing this from another scholar, bridges this idea of humanitarianism and crime fighting, enunciation and practice, politics and patrols. It basically provides this depoliticized language that is needed to make migrant boats an abstract threat to an external border. So this idea of depoliticization of these particular things, and of course, anthropologists have written about this extensively. I'm thinking here James Ferguson's The Anti-Politics Machine. But as Andersson notes at the end here, as if by a conjuring trick, a migrant boat has become a source of risk sold to industrial investors. So it's, here you have folks that are, in some instances, leaving their home countries due to structural policies, economic policies that are well beyond their own personal control. And as we'll see, as we have seen, a lot of this in Seth Holmes's work has to do with this idea of remittances or sending money back home. So this idea of making life better for their families overall. And so overall, in these two screencasts, we've looked at the idea of why move. So the push-pull factors, whether this is voluntary, whether this is structural or forced, and then what should be done to encourage or prevent migration, and who's acted, and what is the justification for that action. And Andersson definitely talks about how this justification is produced and how an entire industry emerges in order to address this. And so migrants are perceived as this potential risk in some settings. But as Kane points out, for Senegal, they're looked at as cultural heroes back home. And of course, this is quite different than the experiences that they have while they're in Europe trying to make a living and send these remittances back home. We looked at migration from earlier this semester in a variety of different contexts that I've mentioned throughout these two screencasts. I touched on historical migration, looking at the out of Africa hypothesis discussed in biological anthropology and anthropology in general. We looked at the trend towards megacities and their increase over time. Again, megacities with 10 million or more inhabitants, as well as a general move, a continuing move of urbanization. We looked at Kane's work on remittances in Senegal, and then we touched on the dire situation that is in 2022 quite prevalent in the news due to Ukraine and Russia. But of course, we see this in a lot of other contexts as well. And then we talked about this idea of unwanted flows in the context of globalization in Andersson's work.